Nome, Alaska, a small city on the edge of the Bering Sea, feels quiet, worn, and familiar. Everyone knows everyone, and word travels fast. Fewer than 4,000 people live here, but the disappearance and murder of a 19-year-old woman would shatter the sense of safety this town once believed it had. When 19-year-old Sonya Ivanoff vanished, it wasn't just another missing person case. It became a turning point in a state where Alaska Native women face some of the highest rates of violence in the country. The case was filled with coincidences. Every clue seemed to point in one direction until investigators realized they had been looking in the wrong place the entire time. What began as a local search became a story about trust, power, and the hard truth that sometimes danger doesn't come from outside, a stranger in the night. It comes from the people we're taught to trust most. Welcome back to Darkly Speaking. My name is Alex Kern, and tonight, we're telling the story that began with one young woman's walk home in the rain and ended with the law written in her name. This is the case of Sonya Ivanoff and the reckoning that changed Alaska forever. The wind sweeps in off the Bering Sea, carrying a bite that settles into everything. The air, the roads, even the silence. Gravel shifts under slow tires, a streetlight buzzes overhead, and somewhere in the distance, dogs are barking. Nome, Alaska feels small in moments like this, a handful of streets pressed between the water and the tundra. A former gold rush town pressed against the edge of the continent, just south of the Arctic Circle. Population barely touching 3,800. Everyone knows everyone, yet, by Alaskan standards, Nome was considered a city, bigger than most villages, yet isolated enough to bear its own kind of darkness. Sonya Ivanoff was 19, determined, bright, and always talking about what comes next. Friends remembered how she dreamed of trading the tundra for Hilo, Hawaii, chasing warmth, a degree, and something bigger than the life she'd known. Nome was her in-between, a place to save money and build a foundation before she made that leap. Born on April 13, 1984, and originally from Inuit, a really small coastal town on a narrow stretch of land between the Norton Sound and the river, she'd grown up surrounded by family and a tight community. She was the fourth of 6 children and came from a very loving and supportive household. Everyone who knew her described her the same way: kind, funny, loyal, a deeply dependable, life-loving young woman. She had a laugh that stuck with you and one that could pull anyone out of a bad mood. In school, she was an honor roll student, and on the basketball court, she was fast and fearless, a hometown favorite who carried the same drive into everything she did. She graduated in 2002, and then she was off to Nome, ready to take that next step and making her mark on the world. Moving to Nome for college and a job at the hospital was her first step toward independence. Not long after settling into Nome, Sonya entered something called the Arctic Native Brotherhood Pageant, an event that celebrates Alaskan Native heritage rather than conventional pageantry. Contestants wore traditional clothing representing their roots with pride. Sonya joined in hoping to earn scholarship money to help pay for college, and her family said she was proud of where she came from, proud to be a Nopiat, and proud to represent her community. Around that same time, she began working at the front desk of a local hospital. A few months later, her best friend Timmery left Inuit to join her, and the two started fresh together in a small apartment near downtown Nome. They didn't have a car, so they walked everywhere. To work, to grab food, to visit friends, even late at night. Back then, it felt safe to do that. Nome was small, familiar, and the idea of something bad happening just didn't seem real. But the reality for Indigenous communities across Alaska tells a different story. According to data from the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, rates of murder, sexual assault, and violent crime among Native American and Alaska Native people are significantly higher than the national average. Native women in particular make up a disproportionate number of missing and murdered individuals. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention reported that in 2020, non-Hispanic American Indian and Alaska Native females experienced the second highest rate of homicide nationwide. with homicide ranking among the top 10 leading causes of death for Native women ages 1 to 45. Nearly half, 43.7% to be exact, reported experiencing rape in their lifetime. In simple terms, these numbers reveal a devastating truth. Native communities face a level of violence that should never feel normal. Yet for many, it has become an everyday reality, especially in Alaska. Sunday, August 10th, 2003, Sonya and her best friend Timmery spent the evening hanging out with friends. Nome has a reputation for its nightlife, but unlike many, the two weren't drinking that night. Timmery later remembered Sonya only having one beer, if that. They stopped by a friend's house around 11 playing board games as a soft Alaskan twilight lingered outside. Remember, it's summertime in Alaska, so the sun barely began to set at this time. By the time it was close to 1 a.m., Timmery, who had an early shift in the morning, decided to call it a night. Sonya wasn't due at work until Tuesday afternoon, so she decided to stay behind a little longer. She loved late nights, especially when it rained. A light mist had started to fall as they said goodbye. Timmery headed toward her friend's place to crash for the night, while Sonya walked the opposite way toward their apartment. Their goodbye was the same as always, a quick inside joke, their usual peace-out gesture, and a laugh carried into the drizzle. Sonya turned and kept walking, stepping into the rain she loved so much. That was the last time anyone saw her. When Timmery got home around 5 the next morning to get ready for work, the bed that they shared was still empty. Sonya hadn't come home. With no cell phones back then, it was easy to think that she'd just stayed at a friend's house, so Timmery went on with her morning, heading to her shift at the Aurora Inn front desk. Usually, Sonya would check in, even briefly, but the silence lasted longer than it should have. By midday, that uneasy feeling settled in. She started calling around, her sister, mutual friends, but no one had seen or heard from Sonya. At first, no one panicked. It was easier to believe that there'd been a change of plans or a mix-up, something ordinary, but as the hours stretched into the evening, that hope started to fade. Sonya's things were still where she'd left them, completely untouched. By the next morning, when she still hadn't come home or shown up for work, it was clear that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something was very, very wrong. Tuesday morning, the apartment is still, the bed is made, Sonya's jacket hangs by the door. Timmery checks the time again and again, hoping she'll hear the door open. Nothing. At work, between guests, she calls Nome PD to ask if Sonya Ivanoff is in custody. The dispatcher sounds calm, matter of fact. No one by that name is in custody, and then the line clicks off. By late afternoon, she walks to the police station crying and worried for her friend. She explains that Sonya hasn't come home and that she's been missing since Sunday evening. The officer behind the counter barely looks up. Another suggests she's probably just out drinking or partying. Naturally, the police didn't seem to take Timmery seriously and just kind of shrugged her off, even believing at first that this was some sort of prank. Although they did take Timmery's report. Kind of, but she's still left without answers. That evening, word reaches Christina, Sonya's sister, and her husband Tom that she hadn't shown up for work that morning. The worry begins to take hold. That just wasn't like Sonya at all. They start calling friends, then drive slow circles through town, headlights stretching across empty streets. The same roads, the same turns. Each stop feels heavier than the last. They ask quietly if anyone's seen her, hoping for even the smallest clue. They think about Canuck, a friend who'd shown interest in Sonya, though she hadn't felt the same way. When they ask police if they know where he might be, the response is just another shrug. The search keeps going, directionless and slow. It isn't until Sonya's boss files an official report that things actually start to move forward. When an officer finally reaches out, the questions feel off. Instead of asking about where Sonya was last seen or who she might have been with that night, they ask about her mental state, if she'd seemed upset, if she and Timmery had argued. The focus feels misplaced and the officer's tone is detached. Later, the fire department joins the effort. Boats move along the coast while volunteers walk the back roads. Timmery drives those same streets over and over, scanning faces, hoping for something, anything to change. While searching, Timmery and a friend drive near the hospital where Sonya worked. A coworker stops them and quietly says they should go to the police station. When they arrive, a crowd has already gathered outside. For a moment, Timmery lets herself believe Sonya's been found. And she has, but not the way anyone hoped. On Wednesday evening at around 8:30 p.m., just 2.5 days since Sonya was last seen, a volunteer firefighter followed tire tracks off Dredge 5 Road near an old mining trail and found a body. When officers arrived, they discovered the nude body of a woman and quickly confirmed what everyone had feared. It was Sonya Ivanoff. The chief of police drove to Tom and Christina's house and asked them to step outside. His words were short and steady. They'd found Sonya, and she was gone. Tom called her parents and Unalakleet to tell them the devastating news. Outside the police station, Timmery stood in silence, frozen, barely processing what she'd heard, completely heartbroken. The search was over, but a murder investigation had begun. The clearing off Dredge Road 5 was silent, except for the wind. Headlights swept over the ground as officers stretched tarps and marked the perimeter. The chief of police called in the Alaska Bureau of Investigation almost immediately. Nome PD knew this was beyond their reach. With rain moving in and the threat of bears nearby, they posted officers overnight to guard the site. By morning, a plane landed carrying ABI investigators and a crime lab team from Anchorage, more than 500 miles away. They moved with practiced calm, unloading equipment, cameras, and evidence kits. The scene spoke for itself. A pool of blood near the body, tire tracks that had cut directly through it, meaning those tires carried blood away. The impressions were clear, so casts were made. One tire tread pattern didn't match the others, a detail that would matter later. On a nearby branch, a faint smear of blue paint suggested a larger vehicle, something that had forced its way through the brush. Even before the autopsy, investigators had a direction, a blue vehicle with mismatched tires. When investigators examined the body, they found Sonya nude except for a single sock. There were bruises on her face and chest and a single gunshot wound to the back of her head. It was immediately clear that this was murder. Her body was carefully recovered and flown with the Anchorage team for an autopsy and forensic analysis. Back at the scene, ABI collected what they could before the weather closed in. Soil fibers, tire casts, bits of debris from the brush. In town, they began interviews with anyone who might have seen her. Friends, co-workers, people who'd been out that night. Each story was the same. She'd been there, then gone. No one could name anyone who would have wanted to hurt her. When Timmery filed her report with Nome PD, they asked for a list of Sonya's friends. Among the names was one that investigators had already heard before, Canuck, whose real name was Daniel Angusuk, a familiar name and face to Nome PD. Daniel had a reputation for a short temper and a history of domestic violence charges involving his girlfriend at the time. Police quickly identified him as a person of interest, not just because of his record or his connection to Sonya, but because he drove a blue truck with mismatched tires. It seemed almost too neat. Could it really be this straightforward, or was it just a coincidence? Investigators didn't know yet, but the connection between the evidence and Daniel's truck was too close to overlook. Back in Unalakleet, Sonya was laid to rest in the same village where she'd grown up. The service took place in the high school gym where she'd spent years playing basketball. People from across the region came to say goodbye. It was simple, quiet, and heavy with the kind of grief the community knew too well. Another young Native woman gone too soon. While her family mourned, investigators were back in Nome trying to understand who had taken her life and why. Back in Nome, ABI found little to work with. No fingerprints, no foreign DNA, no trace of evidence that led anywhere. The rape kit was negative, ruling out sexual assault. What remained kept their focus on Daniel Angusuc. His blue truck with mismatched tires was too close a fit to ignore. Investigators photographed it, made casts of the tires, and tested for blood. Using luminol, the chemical that reacts to trace blood under UV light, they sprayed around the truck and found several reactions. It wasn't definitive, but it was enough to keep digging. When the truck was processed at Nome PD, investigators found a tarp that appeared to have blood on it, 3 rifles behind the driver's seat, one showing possible traces of blood, and a pair of tennis shoes with what looked like bloodstains. The results would take time, but the direction of the case was starting to shift. When Canuck was questioned, he appeared calm and cooperative, denying any involvement. He said the last time he saw Sonya was the Friday before she disappeared during her lunch break. That weekend, he claimed he'd been about 70 miles outside of town hunting with friends. He said he left on Sunday afternoon and didn't return until Monday evening. During questioning, officers noticed scratches on his back, which he said came from his girlfriend. He was taken to the hospital for a physical exam, and a nurse collected DNA samples. When asked about the blood found in and around his truck, he told investigators he'd run over a rabbit that hadn't died right away and struck it to put it out of its misery. He said the blood on his shoes and truck came from that, a rabbit. Or maybe even a porcupine that he shot while hunting. But not Sonya. The explanation sounded thin, and investigators began to doubt his story. Here's what investigators were looking at. Canuck and Sonya knew each other. They were close friends. He drove a blue truck similar to the paint transfer found on a tree branch near the scene. And the tires were mismatched, on the same side as the tracks discovered there. On top of that, blood had been found in and around his truck, lining up with the theory that the suspect's vehicle drove straight through the area where Sonya's body was discovered. Sonya's sister and brother-in-law kept returning to Nome PD, pushing for updates and refusing to let the case fade. Tom, Sonya's brother-in-law, even tried hanging up photos of Sonya at the police department to keep her face and name at the forefront. He was yelled at and told to leave by an officer at the station. Investigators hadn't shared it yet, but they believed they had their guy, Daniel Angusuk. That changed when the DNA results came back from the crime lab. The blood was confirmed to be animal, not human. The tire treads didn't match Daniel's truck, and the blue paint at the scene wasn't the same shade. What once looked certain fell apart. Canuck's story checked out. His friends confirmed his alibi, and investigators even found the porcupine he said he'd shot. He was cleared, and the case was back at the beginning. A blue vehicle, mismatched tires, and no clear suspect. A week after Sonya went missing, only 2 officers were still on her case. Leads had gone cold and progress stalled. The investigation was losing momentum, and the unease in Nome was deepening. Only one of those officers, Brian Wayuvana, among the first to arrive at the scene, worked nights, while his counterpart, Byron Redburn, handled the day shift. Redburn, who had interviewed Canuck, had more time for follow-ups and community outreach, but communication between the two was minimal. Redburn seemed to be keeping details to himself, which led Wayuvana to start re-examining the case from scratch. During the quiet hours of the night shift, he began reviewing every report and note with fresh eyes. That's when he found a handwritten note, a tip that had never been followed up on, one that would soon change everything. It's past midnight and the station is still, and Officer Brian Wayuvana sits at his desk working through the case file again. Near the back, he finds a handwritten note he doesn't remember seeing before. A call record from a woman named Florence Habros, logged weeks earlier but never followed up on. It mentioned she might have information about Sonya. Almost 4 weeks after Sonya was murdered, Wayuvana decides to visit her himself. So, he and his chief drive out to a small home on the edge of Nome. The wind rattles the siding as he knocks on the door. Florence answers the door and steps aside to let them in. They all take a seat and says she remembers that night clearly. She and her sister had been out on the porch smoking. Her sister recognized Sonya walking by and waved. Sonya smiled and waved back and kept walking. Just another quiet night in Nome. A few minutes later, a car came down the street. It slowed as it passed Sonya, then kept going. Moments later, it looped back and stopped ahead of her. From the porch, Florence heard Sonya ask, "What's going on?" The driver rolled down the window. They spoke for a few seconds before Sonya opened the passenger door and got in. The car drove north toward Dredge 5 Road, the same direction where her body would later be found. Florence's sister looked at her watch. Florence even stepped inside to double-check the time. The clock on the wall read 1:26 a.m. This was about 30 minutes after Sonya and Timmery had said goodnight. That would become the last confirmed sighting of Sonya Ivanoff. Florence said she's thought about that night every day since hearing about her disappearance and death. The way Sonya walked up to the car, calm, unafraid, like she must have known the driver. But what Florence remembered most was what she saw on the side of the vehicle when it passed under a streetlight. A decal that read, "Nome Police Department." Wayuvana thanked her, noted every detail, and sat quietly in his patrol car with the police chief before driving back. They both knew what this meant. The investigation could no longer stay with Nome PD. It had to be handed over to the Alaska Bureau of Investigation because now the entire department was implicated. 4 weeks after Sonya Ivanoff disappeared, the case finally had a lead. and the car she was last seen getting into wasn't a stranger's, it was a police cruiser. Investigators were now faced with the very real possibility that one of their own officers was involved. After Florence Habros' statement, the Alaska Bureau of Investigation formally took over the case. Nome PD officers went from investigators to potential suspects. The ABI team flew back in from Anchorage, focused on one question: who was driving the police cruiser Florence saw Sonya getting into? From the beginning, it was clear how little evidence the killer had left behind. No fingerprints, no foreign DNA, even Sonya's clothing was still missing. Whoever did this understood how to remove or prevent DNA transfer, how to erase a trail entirely. It pointed to someone trained in police procedure. Nome PD owned only 3 Ford Expeditions, none assigned as take-home vehicles. That meant whoever was driving that night had to be on duty. Investigators narrowed down the list to 2 names, Matthew Owens and Stan Piscoya. Both had been on the force for about 3 years. Owens was the same officer who yelled at Tom to take down the photos of Sonya when he was trying to hang them up at the police station. Piscoya was the one who brushed off Timmery's first report. Both were scheduled for interviews and polygraphs in Anchorage. But before they could leave, something unexpected happened. Just after midnight on September 23rd, a sergeant noticed Cruiser 321 was missing from the lot. He radioed the officer on duty, Matt Owens, to ask if he knew where it was. Owens said he didn't. When the vehicle still couldn't be found, the sergeant called the chief. Then, at 2:51 a.m., Owens radioed back. He'd located the cruiser, parked on a dirt road near where Sonya's body had been discovered. 2 minutes later, another call. Shots fired. Officers raced to the area, lights cutting through the dark. When they arrived, everything was still. Owens came out of the brush and said he'd heard 2 gunshots and ran into the tundra. He told them the scare made him think about his family and that he wasn't sure if he wanted to stay on the force. The search turned up no shooter, no shell casings, no footprints. What they did find was Cruiser 321. Its driver's side window had been smashed, glass covering the seat and ground. Someone had thrown a rock through it. On the driver's seat was an envelope, addressed to Nome PD. Inside was a typed letter, a message from Sonya's killer. Back at the station, ABI investigators opened it, and inside were 2 items: Sonya Ivanoff's gym ID and a single typed page addressed to the Nome Police Department. The letter began with hostility and profanity, calling officers pigs. It claimed the writer hated the police, said Sonya was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and bragged about taking, quote, your pig car keys, end quote. It ended with the threat to shoot any officer who came close. The tone was mocking and aggressive, written to sound like a stranger, not someone inside the PD. On its face, the note suggested a random attacker who had stolen a police vehicle and killed Sonya by chance. It even mentioned taking keys from an unattended cruiser, a detail that could technically happen in Nome, where patrol cars were sometimes left with the keys still in the ignition. But the scenario didn't align with what Florence Habros had witnessed. Sonya had approached the cruiser calmly, speaking to the driver like she knew him. Nothing about her reaction matched the behavior of someone being approached by a stranger. ABI investigators suspected the letter wasn't a confession at all, but an attempt to redirect suspicion. Whoever wrote it had access to Sonya's identification and insider knowledge of police procedure. It looked like deliberate misdirection, meant to make the killer seem like an outsider. Despite the chaos surrounding Cruiser 321, the interviews and polygraphs for both officers went forward as planned. On August 24th, the day after the cruiser was found, Officer Stan Piscoya was tested first. Matthew Owens, claiming to be shaken after the supposed shots fired incident, met with the department counselor instead of leaving for Anchorage. His turn would come later. By the following morning, the letter was logged, the polygraphs underway, and the investigation was closing in. Whoever wrote that note hadn't thrown detectives off. They'd confirmed the search was already in the right place. Officer Stan Piscoya was the first to be questioned in Anchorage. He told investigators that during the early morning hours when Florence Habros saw a police cruiser stop for Sonya, he was inside Nome PD finishing reports. Station logs confirmed activity in that window. Piscoya said he never saw Sonya that night and had nothing to do with her disappearance or death. He took the polygraph first, passed easily, and was cleared. This left only Matt Owens. 5 days later, on August 29th, investigators met with Officer Matthew Owens in Anchorage. They asked him to walk through his night shift from August 10th into the morning of August 11th. Owens said he went on patrol, dropped Pascoya off at around 3 a.m., returned to the station to write reports, then heard what sounded like a gunshot. He claimed he drove out to check but was then dispatched on a minor call and returned to the station until his shift ended at around 7 a.m. His story, like Pascoya's, kept him nowhere near Dredge 5 Road. While Owens sat for questioning, ABI agents in Nome continued their background work. They found a pattern of misconduct, careless reports, ignored directives, and repeated requests for late-night shifts. Multiple women in Nome described inappropriate encounters with Matt. It was discovered that Matt Owens would pick up women and have sex with them while he was on duty. Some said he offered rides in his patrol car. Others said he followed them, circling the same streets and pulling ahead to cut them off. Sound familiar? The accounts closely mirrored what Florence Habros described the night Sonya vanished. Owens and Sonya knew each other through her work at the hospital, and seeing his cruiser that night likely wouldn't have seemed threatening. It would have seemed familiar. When Owens finally took his polygraph, the results were immediate. His stress levels spiked on every question tied to Sonya Ivanoff. He reacted sharply when asked if he'd seen her that night or had been near her when her body was found. Owens failed the test miserably. Investigators read him his rights and told him he was now the prime suspect. At first, he stayed composed, then defensive, denying the murder, denying the stolen cruiser, and when the questions turned to his conduct with women, his tone hardened. ABI pointed out that his behavior matched what witnesses had seen the night Sonya disappeared. Owens pushed back, saying his personal life had nothing to do with the case and insisting he'd done nothing wrong. Furthermore, when investigators reviewed his account of the stolen cruiser, more inconsistencies appeared. Owens said he spotted the vehicle pulled off the highway, its taillights still on, suggesting someone was inside or had just stepped out. If he truly thought he was approaching an armed suspect, standard procedure called for drawing his weapon, calling for backup, and clearing the scene. Instead, he claimed he approached alone, unarmed, and without a flashlight. His next statement, that shots were fired and he ran into the tundra to hide until other officers arrived, only raised even more red flags. Why flee instead of taking cover or radioing for help? His story didn't hold together, and the failed polygraph, the pattern of behavior, and his connection to Sonya all pointed in one direction. Investigators believed Matt Owens had abducted and murdered her, staging the Cruiser 321 incident to deflect blame. But belief isn't proof. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no direct witnesses tying him to Dredge 5 Road. Without hard evidence, they couldn't charge him. Owens was released. When he returned to Nome, his life started to collapse. He was placed on administrative leave, went through a bitter divorce, and was in the middle of a custody battle for his young son, living out of a friend's spare room. Matthew Owens was no longer the officer investigating a murder. He was the prime suspect in the largest case Nome has ever seen. When investigators interviewed Matthew Owens' soon-to-be ex-wife, one memory stood out. She recalled a call from him on August 12th, his birthday. Around 4:30 that afternoon, he said he needed to drop off their son early because he had to go into work, mentioning that there was a missing girl and the situation didn't sound good. At that time, Sonya hadn't been reported missing. No public notice had gone out. No search had begun. That phone call became the first documented proof of foreknowledge, the moment investigators realized Owens knew Sonya was gone before anyone else did. In the weeks that followed, ABI continued to build their case. They interviewed another woman who said she'd been seeing Owens casually. She told investigators that he'd been talking about leaving Alaska soon and asking her to come with him. This prompted the ABI to take action and prevent Owens from fleeing while they kept digging. Then, on October 25th, 2003, 2.5 months after Sonya's murder, Matthew Owens was arrested and charged. The next day, he was arraigned. Members of his mostly white church filled the courtroom, showing support for him, questioning the investigation, and harassing Sonya's family, claiming Owens' innocence. For Sonya's family sitting in silence, it was another kind of loss, a painful reminder of how deep denial and racism ran in Nome. After the arrest made headlines, more women came forward. Their accounts were consistent: stalking, coercion, and sexual assault while Owens was on duty. One woman said he assaulted her after arresting her. Another was coerced into having sex with Owens. Afterwards, remember him telling her that nobody would believe her over a cop. In total, 6 women accused him of crimes ranging from stalking to rape. Several said they'd tried reporting him before but were ignored. Absolutely disgusting. As investigators kept collecting evidence, they re-examined early leads, the mismatched tire tracks and blue paint transfer once thought crucial. Both turned out to be completely unrelated. The vehicle belonged to a man who'd parked nearby with his girlfriend, just feet away from where Sonya's body was later found. It was just a haunting coincidence. Investigators needed something tangible: DNA, a weapon, a traceable object. Owens was released on bail after 2 months in jail, awaiting trial under supervision. Nome watched, divided. Then came the search at Coffee Creek, a hunting camp about 70 miles north of town, a place Owens was known to visit. Witnesses remembered seeing him there burning something in a fire pit. When investigators dug through the ashes, they found what they'd been missing: eyelets from Skechers shoes, metal fragments from a bra, a button stamped with the Tilt logo, the same brand of jeans Sonya wore as confirmed by her sister Christina. Deeper in the pit, a key linked to Owens' uncle's post office box. For the first time, they had physical evidence connecting Owens to Sonya's belongings. As for the murder weapon, from the autopsy, investigators already knew Sonya had been killed with a .22 caliber round. Back at the Dredge 5 site, they uncovered spent .22 shells, the type used in an automatic pistol. In Nome PD's evidence locker, they found a Jennings .22 that matched those same casings. The gun had been logged into evidence long before Sonya's death, and the ABI believe it's possible that it could have been removed, used, and then quietly returned. The evidence finally told a story: burned clothing at Coffee Creek, a key tied to Owens, shell casings matching a firearm believed to have been taken from the police evidence locker, statements from multiple women describing assault and coercion, and a phone call that came too soon. Let's not forget the failed polygraph. For months, the case against Matthew Owens had lived in suspicion. Now, investigators could hold the truth in their hands. 17 months after Sonya Ivanoff's murder, the first trial of Matthew Owens began on January 18, 2005 in Anchorage. The case had been moved from Nome, a town too fractured and too familiar with the story to seat a fair jury. The prosecution argued that Owens used his badge as leverage, luring Sonya into his patrol car, killing her, and staging the scene to look like an attack on law enforcement. The defense claimed Owens was a scapegoat, a convenient target for a department desperate to deflect blame. Over several weeks, the state called nearly 70 witnesses. They presented the phone call Owens made to his ex-wife before Sonya was even reported missing, the Jennings .22 pistol found in Nome PD's evidence locker that matched shell casings from the scene, and the Coffee Creek evidence, the Skechers eyelet, bra fragments, Tilt jeans button, and key linked to Owens' uncle's post office box. They outlined his late-night patrol patterns and his familiarity with Sonya through her hospital shifts. The Coffee Creek discovery became the foundation of their case, the physical connection between Owens and Sonya they'd been searching for since the start. The defense countered that the evidence was circumstantial at best. A witness said they'd seen Sonya driving a blue pickup the following Monday night, after prosecutors claimed she was already dead. They argued the .22 pistol couldn't be proven to be the murder weapon and that the key in the fire pit belonged to Owens' uncle, who said Owens never had access to it. They repeated the same refrain: no DNA, no fingerprints, no witnesses. Then, in a risky move, Owens took the stand. He denied killing Sonya or stealing Cruiser 321. He claimed his ex-wife misremembered the date of the phone call and admitted he had looked Sonya up in the police database, but it was only to check her age. He insisted he was being framed by the department. The 6 women's assault accounts were ruled inadmissible in court, meaning the jury never heard about the broader pattern of predatory behavior investigators had uncovered. The defense then turned attention toward another officer, Byron Redburn. They alleged that he had motive, Owens had reported him for excessive force, and Redburn allegedly held a grudge. They also suggested that Owens had been having an affair with Redburn's daughter, further fueling tension between the two men. The defense even claimed Redburn planted the pistol in the evidence locker to frame Owens, but of course, there was no proof of this. After more than 40 hours of deliberation, the jury couldn't reach a verdict. The judge declared a mistrial. Owens walked free. For Sonya's family, it was devastation all over again. The man accused of killing their daughter walked out of court. 7 months later, the state retried Owens, this time in Kotzebue, a remote Arctic city a plane ride away from Nome. Both sides came back with the same arguments. The prosecution relied on the same forensic trail. The defense leaned on the same doubts. But near the end of the second trial, investigators received a new lead. The tip came from Officer Brian Wayuvana, the same man who had uncovered the call from Florence Habros. His neighbor, Dealey Blackshear, mentioned that a woman named Charlotte Calandrelli had seen Sonya's ID in Owens' room. Calandrelli had rented out a room to Owens after his separation with his ex-wife. If this is true, it meant Sonya's belongings were inside the place where Owens was renting. Investigators believed Calandrelli was referring to Sonya's gym card, the very same one that was recovered in Cruiser 321. They recorded a call between Blackshear and Calandrelli. On the call, she admitted she never reported seeing the ID because she'd read that Sonya's card had already been recovered. But she didn't deny seeing it. When Calandrelli was called to testify, she denied everything. Prosecutors responded by playing the recorded call in court. The contradiction was clear, and it was enough to sway the jury. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated and returned a unanimous verdict. Matthew Owens was found guilty of the murder of Sonya Ivanoff. Investigators believed Owens had fixated on Sonya for weeks, that on that rainy Sunday night when he saw her walking home, he saw an opportunity. He convinced her to get into his vehicle and likely suggested sex, and when she refused and threatened to expose him, he killed her. Owens was sentenced to 101 years in prison. To this day, he denies any involvement in Sonya Ivanoff's murder. It took 2 trials, dozens of witnesses, and years of silence to bring a single man to justice. Sonya Ivanoff's story forced Alaska to look closer, not just at who killed her, but at the system that allowed him to wear a badge while doing it. For Nome, Sonya's story isn't history. It's still present tense. It lives in every conversation about justice, every question about trust, every mother who tells her daughter to be careful while walking home. Sonya Ivanoff wanted to leave Nome, to see something bigger than the small world she grew up in. She never got that chance. But because of her, things started to change. Not fast enough and not completely, but enough to make sure that her story was finally heard. In 2007, then-Governor Sarah Palin signed the Sonya Ivanoff Act into law. The bill made it an automatic first-degree murder charge for any law enforcement officer who kills someone while on duty, ensuring harsher penalties and clearer accountability for abuses of power. It was one of the first state laws in Alaska created in direct response to the murder of an Indigenous woman, a lasting piece of justice written in her name. It wouldn't be until 2018 for Nome to see real change within their police department. Michael Heinzelman stepped in as Nome's police chief in 2018, and he'd never heard the name Matthew Owens or what happened to Sonya Ivanoff. But that changed almost instantly. At one of his first city meetings, people stood up one by one, some angry, others shaking, telling him why they didn't trust the department. They talked about the officer who murdered a Native woman and how, decades later, that wound never closed. Heinzelman realized what kind of work lay ahead. Rebuilding trust in Nome wasn't going to happen with a few good intentions. It would take years of accountability. When he took over, Heinzelman found a backlog of hundreds of uninvestigated sexual assault cases, roughly 460 open files, most involving Alaska Native women. It was a devastating record, a reminder that what happened to Sonya wasn't an isolated tragedy, but part of a larger pattern that had been ignored for far too long. Since then, Nome PD has moved into a new building, and Heinzelman says it's a different department now, one that knows how much it has to prove. There are still no Alaska Native officers or investigators, but the department now has an Alaska Native victims advocate who focuses on domestic violence and sexual assault cases. Small steps, but steps forward nonetheless. In Nome, people still speak her name. Some do it softly, others with anger, but everyone remembers. The case changed how the town looked at its police and how Alaska began talking about the crisis facing missing and murdered Indigenous women. But for Sonya's friends and family, the legacy is more personal. It's in the quiet lessons they pass on to their children, to stay aware, to speak up, and to look out for one another. It's in the small acts of care that come from loss and the way they keep her memory alive through kindness and strength. Sonya's story continues to resonate across Alaska, in classrooms, in advocacy circles, and in the conversations that push for better protection of Indigenous women and fairer law enforcement. Her name stands as both a warning and a call to do better, proof that one life, even one taken too soon, can still change the entire system. And for those who knew her best, remembering her isn't just about loss anymore. It's about the strength that follows, the laughter they still share when they talk about her, and the hope that one day no one will have to learn justice the way she did. If you want to dig even deeper into this case, check out our website at darklyspeakingpodcast.com, where you can find all of the source materials and show notes. And don't forget to follow along on socials at Darkly Speaking Podcast for your dose of dark and chilling content. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time with a brand new episode.